February 12, 1946, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The mess hall fell silent. 600 German prisoners of war sat motionless, their tin plates untouched, the steam rising from hot food they refused to eat. Outside, the Kansas wind howled across the prairie, but inside the only sound was the nervous shuffling of American guards who had never seen anything like this. These weren't men rebelling against captivity. These were prisoners rebelling against freedom. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, a former Afrika Korps soldier who had picked sugar beets alongside Kansas farmers for 3 years, stood slowly. His English had become nearly perfect. "We will not eat," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall, "until we receive guarantee we will not be sent back to Germany." The American camp commander, Colonel Francis Howard, stood in the doorway, a telegram crumpled in his fist. It contained orders from Washington. All German POWs were to be repatriated immediately, per the Geneva Convention. He had expected relief, perhaps even celebration. Instead, he faced something the War Department had never anticipated: prisoners who would rather starve than go home. This is the story of a rebellion that has been nearly erased from history. A protest not against captivity, but against liberation. And it reveals a truth about World War II that neither the Nazis nor the Allies wanted anyone to know. The American Captivity Paradox. To understand why German soldiers fought to stay in American prison camps, you have to understand what their captivity actually looked like. And it was nothing like what they'd been told to expect. When Lieutenant Werner Kritzinger was captured in Tunisia in May 1943, he had been warned by his superiors about American brutality. Nazi propaganda had taught him that if captured, he would face torture, starvation, possibly execution. He and his fellow prisoners were transported across the Atlantic in cramped ship holds, convinced they were sailing toward their doom. What he found instead was Camp Hearn, Texas. "I could not believe my eyes," Kritzinger later wrote in a letter that would be preserved in the National Archives. "The American guards handed us Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. We had been fighting for years, eating black bread when we could get it. And they gave us this sweet cold drink like we were guests, not enemies." By the end of 1945, the United States held approximately 425,000 German POWs in over 700 camps scattered across the country. This was the largest POW operation in American history. The camp stretched from Camp Pine in New York to Camp Clarinda in Iowa, from Camp Mexia in Texas to Camp Rupert in Idaho. And due to a combination of Geneva Convention requirements, American agricultural labor shortages, and a fundamentally different philosophy of imprisonment, these camps operated in ways that shocked the German prisoners. Daily calorie count for German POWs in American camps was set at 4,000 calories, higher than the Icon ration for American civilians, and nearly double what German civilians were receiving in bombed-out German cities by 1944. Prisoners were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip for labor. They had access to libraries, sports equipment, musical instruments. Many camps had their own newspapers, theaters, and orchestras. At Camp Como in Mississippi, German POWs published a newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, that included book reviews, poetry, and philosophical debates. At Camp Mexia in Texas, prisoners built an elaborate miniature German village complete with a working fountain. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, they formed a 50-piece symphony orchestra that performed Beethoven and Mozart for local townspeople. Gefreiter Otto Weiner, captured in Normandy in August 1944, had lost 40 pounds during the fighting in France. Within 4 months at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, he had gained it all back. "I felt guilty eating so much," he recalled in a 1983 interview with the U.S. Army Military History Institute. "My mother's letters told me she was surviving on turnips and potato peels, and here I was eating roast beef and ice cream, but the food was only part of the story. What truly transformed these prisoners was their interaction with ordinary Americans, crossing the wire. The Geneva Convention permitted POWs to work, provided they weren't employed in war industries. With American men fighting overseas and a desperate labor shortage crippling agriculture, the U.S. government implemented an extensive POW labor program. Starting in 1943, German prisoners were contracted out to farms, canneries, and lumber camps across the country. This is where the barriers really broke down. Every morning at Camp Concordia in Kansas, trucks would arrive to transport prisoners to local farms. These weren't just work assignments. They were cultural exchanges that neither side had anticipated. German POWs ate lunch at farmers' tables. They learned English from farmers' children. They celebrated Thanksgiving and Christmas with American families. They fell in love with American girls, though fraternization was officially prohibited. Martha Mueller, a German-American farm wife in Kansas, later recalled, "We had 3 German boys working our wheat harvest in 1944. My husband was overseas fighting. And here I was feeding German soldiers at my kitchen table. But they weren't the monsters from the newsreels. They were homesick boys who showed me pictures of their mothers and asked if my husband was safe." The transformation went both ways. American farmers who had started the war wanting vengeance found themselves seeing Germans as individuals, and German soldiers, raised on propaganda about American degeneracy and Jewish-controlled capitalism, discovered a nation of stunning abundance and casual kindness. By mid-1945, over 200,000 German POWs were working outside the camps. They harvested cotton in Texas, picked fruit in California, cut timber in Minnesota, and processed sugar beets in Colorado. They earned money, sent letters home describing what they saw, and began imagining futures that didn't involve returning to a destroyed Germany. Hauptmann Erich Seibold, a Luftwaffe officer, held at Camp McCain in Mississippi, wrote in his diary on June 15, 1945, "Today I learned the war in Europe has ended. I expected to feel joy. Instead I feel dread. What happens to us now? Do we return to the wasteland Germany has become? My city Dresden no longer exists. My parents are dead. What is there to return to?" This was the question haunting thousands of German POWs as 1945 drew to a close, and it was a question the US government was not prepared to answer in the way the prisoners hoped. The announcement. On January 4, 1946, the War Department issued General Order No. 12. All German POWs were to be repatriated with utmost speed in accordance with Geneva Convention requirements. The goal was to have all prisoners returned to Germany by July 1946. The announcement traveled through the camp system like an electric shock. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, commandant of the prisoner compound, Oberst Klaus Mittendorf, immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. The men became quiet, he reported to American authorities. There was no singing in the evenings. Many stopped eating properly. Several asked to speak with the camp chaplain, which they had never done before. The statistics painted a stark picture of what awaited them in Germany. By early 1946, 20% of Berlin was rubble. In Hamburg, 50% of all housing had been destroyed. Cologne's population had dropped from 750,000 to 40,000. The daily calorie ration in the British zone of occupation had fallen to 40 calories. Starvation levels. The Soviet zone was even worse. More frightening was the uncertainty. Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Prisoners had no control over which zone they would be sent to. And stories of Soviet treatment of German prisoners were terrifying. Of the approximately 3 million German POWs captured by the Soviets, an estimated 1 million would die in captivity. Even those from Western Germany faced grim prospects. There was no housing, minimal food, and essentially no economy. Many prisoners knew their families were dead or displaced. Some learned their hometowns were now in Soviet-controlled territory, meaning return was impossible. And then there was a more profound realization, one that many POWs struggled to articulate even to themselves. They had changed. After years in America, they no longer fit into the Germany they'd left behind, and that Germany no longer existed anyway. On January 18, 1946, at Camp Concordia in Kansas, a group of prisoners drafted a petition. It was written in careful English and addressed to President Harry Truman. The document, preserved in the National Archives, reads in part, "We, the undersigned, respectfully request permission to remain in the United States of America. We have worked honestly for American farmers who will testify to our character. We have learned to respect American democracy and wish to become citizens. Germany is destroyed and holds nothing for us. We prefer to remain as prisoners if necessary, rather than return to certain starvation and possibly death. It was signed by 347 men. Similar petitions appeared at camps across the country. At Camp Hearn in Texas, 4 to 12 prisoners signed. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, 289. At Camp Clark in Missouri, over 500. The answer from Washington was unequivocal. No. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. There would be no exceptions. That's when the resistance began. The rebellion. The first hunger strike started at Camp Concordia on February 12, 1946, the scene that opened this story. Within a week, similar strikes had spread to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. The American camp commanders were baffled. Colonel Francis Howard at Concordia had dealt with occasional disciplinary problems, fights between Nazi hardliners and anti-Nazi prisoners, minor work refusals, escape attempts. But this was different. This was organized, non-violent, and emotionally complex. How do I discipline men for not wanting to leave prison? He wrote in a report to the War Department, dated February 18th. These are not violent men. They're not destroying property. They're simply refusing to cooperate with their own liberation. The strikes weren't the only form of resistance. At Camp Dermot in Arkansas, prisoners staged coordinated work slowdowns, accomplishing at half speed what they'd previously done efficiently. Local farmers who had contracted for their labor complained to the camp administration. "These boys have worked hard for us for 2 years," one farmer wrote in a letter to his congressman. "Now you're sending them back to starvation? Where's the humanity in that?" At Camp Como in Mississippi, a group of prisoners hired a local lawyer, using their accumulated work wages, to explore legal options for staying. The lawyer, a young attorney named Robert Hutchinson, actually took the case seriously, researching immigration law and writing to the State Department. His February 1946 brief argued that German POWs who had performed essential civilian labor should be eligible for special immigration status. The State Department's response was swift and negative. Granting such requests would violate international law, undermine the Geneva Convention, and create impossible precedents. An official wrote back on March 3rd, "The petitions must be denied and repatriation must proceed." But the prisoners' resistance grew more creative and desperate. At Camp Hearn in Texas, Unteroffizier Josef Kramer had fallen in love with a German-American woman named Anna Schneider, whose family owned a dairy farm where he'd worked for 18 months. Fraternization was forbidden, but in the relative freedom of work assignments, relationships had formed. Kramer proposed marriage, hoping it might provide legal grounds to stay. Anna Schneider applied for permission to marry Kramer. The army denied it. Immigration authorities made clear that even if they married, Kramer would still be deported, and Anna, as an American citizen, would have to choose between her country and her husband. On March 15, 1946, Kramer attempted suicide by cutting his wrists. He survived, but the incident sent shockwaves through the camp system. Military intelligence began monitoring for similar incidents. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, prisoners stopped singing German songs in the evenings, a tradition that had been part of camp life for years. Instead, they sang American songs they'd learned, "Home on the Range," "You Are My Sunshine," even "The Star-Spangled Banner." It was a quiet, mournful form of protest, a way of declaring who they felt they'd become. The American Guards, many of whom had formed friendships with prisoners over years of service, struggled with their orders. Private First Class James Morrison, a guard at Camp Trinidad, wrote in a letter home dated March 22nd. "We're packing up boys who've worked beside us, eaten with us, played baseball with us. Some are crying, others just look dead inside. I joined up to fight Germans and I did. But these don't feel like the enemy anymore." The individual stories. Behind the statistics and strikes were individual human stories of heartbreaking complexity. Werner Lenz had been captured at Salerno, Italy in September 1943. He spent nearly 3 years at Camp Swift in Texas, where he worked as a carpenter. When he learned his hometown of Dresden had been destroyed in the February 1945 firebombing, he received confirmation that his entire family was dead. Parents, sister, fiancé. What was he returning to? Lenz wrote a letter to the camp chaplain, Father William O'Connor, that has been preserved in the Catholic Diocese of Austin archives. Dated April 3, 1946, it reads, Father, I believe in God's plan, but I cannot understand it. I survived the war only to be sent back to a graveyard. Everyone I loved is dead. The city I knew is ash. Here in Texas, I have friends. I have purpose. The family I work for treats me like a son. Why must I leave life to return to death? Father O'Connor tried to intervene with military authorities on Lenz's behalf. He was told politely but firmly that exceptions were impossible. Then there was Helmut Friedrich, a former teacher from Hamburg, who had been captured in France in 1944. At Camp Mexia in Texas, Friedrich taught English classes to other prisoners and German classes to interested American guards. He had developed a friendship with the camp's education officer, Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, bonding over their shared love of literature. When repatriation orders came, Bradley wrote a formal letter of recommendation for Friedrich, testifying to his anti-Nazi beliefs and his potential value as an American citizen. This man, Bradley wrote, represents the best of what Germany could become. He believes in democracy, has completely rejected Nazi ideology, and would be an asset to our nation. The letter was filed and forgotten. Friedrich was shipped back to Germany in May 1946. At Camp Clark in Missouri, a prisoner named Carl Becker had become close to a local farming family named Wilson. The Wilson's son had been killed at Normandy. Initially, they had been hostile to the German prisoners, but over time, working alongside Becker, they found something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a more complex understanding. When Becker was scheduled for deportation, Mr. Wilson drove to the camp and asked to see the commander. "I know this is unusual," he said, according to a report filed by the camp adjutant on April 10th. "My boy died fighting Germans, but Carl isn't who killed him. Can't we see the difference? Carl wants to stay. We want him to stay. He could work our farm. Why isn't that possible?" The commander had no answer that satisfied anyone. The forced departure. Despite the protests, petitions, and pleas, repatriation proceeded on schedule. The process was systematic and impersonal. Prisoners were loaded onto trains, transported to ports, and placed on Liberty ships bound for Europe. Most were delivered to ports in France and England, then transferred to camps in occupied Germany to await processing and final release. At Camp Concordia, the hunger strike ended, not because prisoners changed their minds, but because camp authorities threatened to force-feed strikers and punish them with solitary confinement before deportation. Faced with spending their final days in America in isolation, most chose to eat and spend their remaining time with friends. The final transports left American camps between April and July 1946. At Camp Hearn, local townspeople came to the fence to say goodbye, which was unprecedented. Some brought gifts, food for the journey, addresses where letters could be sent, photographs. German prisoners lined up for roll call one last time, collected their few possessions, and marched to waiting trucks under armed guard. Many wept openly. On May 23, 1946, the last group of prisoners left Camp Concordia. Hans Schmidt, the man who had stood to announce the hunger strike 4 months earlier, was among them. As the truck pulled away, he looked back at the camp at the Kansas prairie, at the country that had been his home longer than anywhere since the war began. An American guard who witnessed the departure later recalled, "They looked like men going to execution, not men going home." What happened after? The fate of the repatriated prisoners varied dramatically. Those sent to the American, British, or French zones faced severe hardship, but generally survived. They returned to cities of rubble, an economy in collapse, and a population traumatized and divided. Finding housing was nearly impossible. Food remained scarce until the Marshall Plan began delivering aid in 1948. For those whose homes were now in the Soviet zone, the situation was far worse. Many were immediately rearrested and sent to Soviet labor camps. Others disappeared into a police state, where their time in America made them suspect. A few prisoners did eventually make it back to America, though it took years. Werner Lenz, the carpenter from Dresden, immigrated to the United States in 1952 under the Displaced Persons Act. He settled in Texas, not far from Camp Swift, where he'd been imprisoned. He worked as a carpenter until his death in 1989. Helmut Friedrich, the teacher, also eventually immigrated. Arriving in 1954, he taught German at a high school in Missouri and wrote a memoir in 1976, titled Prisoner of Peace, describing his conflicted experience as a German POW in America. Carl Becker managed to return in 1953, sponsored by the Wilson family in Missouri. He worked their farm for 20 years, never married, and was buried in the Wilson family plot when he died in 1973. But these were the exceptions. Most never returned. They rebuilt lives in Germany, carried memories of America like ghosts, and rarely spoke about their time as prisoners who had fought to stay imprisoned. Joseph Kramer, who attempted suicide rather than leave Anna Schneider, survived and was deported. Anna waited 3 years, then traveled to Germany to find him in 1949. They married in Munich and she stayed in Germany with him, giving up her American citizenship, the reverse of what they'd hoped. The Forgotten Rebellion. Why has this story been so thoroughly forgotten? Partly because it complicated the narrative both sides wanted to tell. For America, the story of German POWs who loved captivity raised uncomfortable questions about why prisoners lived better than many American civilians, especially black Americans who were still subject to Jim Crow laws. Several of the camps where Germans were held had better facilities than African American neighborhoods nearby, a fact that did not escape notice. For Germany, the story was even more uncomfortable. It suggested that some German soldiers had preferred America to the fatherland, which challenged post-war narratives of universal German suffering and victimhood. But perhaps most significantly, it was forgotten because it humanized the enemy in ways that didn't fit clean categories. These weren't concentration camp guards or SS fanatics. They were ordinary soldiers who had discovered in captivity that the enemy they'd been taught to hate was more humane than the regime they'd served. The military files on POW resistance to repatriation were classified for decades. When they were finally opened, they revealed the scale of the protests. At least 15,000 German POWs across more than 30 camps had participated in some form of resistance, hunger strikes, petitions, work stoppages, legal appeals. None of it changed the outcome. By August 1946, fewer than 5,000 German POWs remained in the United States, mostly those deemed too sick to travel or those facing war crimes investigations. By 1947, the camps were empty. The last documented letter from a German POW protesting repatriation is dated June 30, 1946, from Camp Shanks in New York, a staging area for deportation. The prisoner's name was Heinrich Müller. He wrote to the camp commander, "I do not ask to avoid punishment for my country's crimes. I ask only to be allowed to stay and build something better than what we destroyed. Is that not justice too?" No response is recorded in his file. He was shipped to Germany on July 5, 1946. Reflections. The story of German POWs who fought to stay in America reveals something profound about the nature of ideology, identity, and human connection. These men had been raised in a totalitarian state, indoctrinated with propaganda about racial superiority and the degeneracy of democracy. They had fought for Hitler's vision of Europe. And yet, when confronted with the reality of American life, not perfect, not without its own deep injustices, but fundamentally different from what they'd been told, many of them changed. They changed not through punishment or re-education programs, but through ordinary human contact. Through eating at farmhouse tables, through working alongside people they'd been taught to despise, through discovering that the enemy wasn't monstrous, just human. And when given the choice between returning to a familiar ideology in ruins or embracing a new future in a foreign land, thousands chose the latter. They chose it knowing they might never see their families again. They chose it knowing they'd be marked as traitors by some. They chose it through the desperate logic of people who had seen both sides and understood the difference. The rebellion failed, of course. The Geneva Convention was clear, and international law demanded repatriation. The United States could not simply absorb hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers, no matter how reformed they appeared. But the fact that it happened at all, that German soldiers would hunger strike to stay in prison camps, that American farmers would plead for prisoners to remain, that the lines between captor and captive could blur so completely, tells us something essential about the human capacity for change and connection. Even in the midst of history's darkest chapter, in February 1946, in a Kansas mess hall, 600 men refused to eat because they wanted to stay in prison. It was a rebellion that made no sense by the logic of war. But by the logic of human transformation, it made perfect sense. They had come to America as enemies and found something they hadn't expected, a future. Being forced to give it up felt not like liberation, but like a second capture. This time a capture by fate, by law, by the implacable demands of history, And so they resisted, knowing it was futile, because the alternative was accepting that what they'd discovered about America, about themselves, about the possibility of becoming something different than what they'd been, meant nothing in the face of international treaties and political necessity. They lost their rebellion. But the fact that they fought it remains a hidden chapter of World War II that deserves to be remembered, not as a curiosity, but as a testament to the human capacity for change, and the tragedy of circumstances that prevent that change from being fully realized. The camps are gone now. Most have been completely erased, returned to farmland, converted to other uses, or simply abandoned to decay. But in the archives the letters remain, the petitions, the reports of hunger strikes and desperate pleas, and somewhere in those documents is a truth that neither side wanted to acknowledge, that even in war, people are capable of becoming more than their circumstances would suggest. Sometimes even prisoners can be transformed. Sometimes even enemies can become neighbors. Sometimes the hardest prison to escape is the one waiting at home.